first three are John McGinnis, Stanley Fish, and Rick Kay. John?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I thought it was an excellent paper, and really, I envy someone so young who can have written it. I certainly think it's a tour de force for someone just a few years out of law school. It's a great paper in any event. I have three very brief points. One, it won't surprise you that I think you're a little too easy on conceptual originalists and too hard on consequentialist originalists. For the conceptualist originalists, I don't think
I
that...
thought it was the other way around.
Well, in some sense, I don't think that Stanley and I will disagree on this. In some sense, the conceptual point is not that they're trivial. They make an important point, but as I think Stanley admits, the point just doesn't really go to judges at all, what they should do. It just doesn't go to that at all, and I think that should be made more clear if you are simply a conceptual originalist. Consequentialist originalists, well, I think you deal with some kinds of consequentialist originalists in the sense of constraint that they may have some problems of integrity. Note that's a different kind of criticism than the criticism of conceptualists. You could, if you have integrity, you might be able to carry it out. It's just a tendency. But you could think of some kinds of consequentialists who would be kind of rule consequentialists who really wouldn't be subject even to that pressure to any of the same kind of degree. They think in general the consequences are good. Number three is, you had one thing I worried about. You suggested that the distinction between consequentialist originalism and conceptualist originalism mapped on pretty closely between the soft and hard originalism, and I'm not sure it does map on completely. I think you could be, as I understand, soft and hard originalism. And soft originalism, you consider originalism, but other things in your construction of the Constitution. Hard originalism only exclusively, and it seems to me you could be an exclusive consequentialist originalist.
Well, first I want to say that yes, I'm of the conceptualist party and accept the valid but trivial characterization of that party, with trivial meaning that originalism, as I understand it, does not aid you by giving you directions and or imperatives for actual interpretive work. What I want to generally say is intended by me to be in support of William's paper and to be in part a response to some of the things that Vikram said. The first thing I would allude to is the possibility that Vikram raised that originalism may be too complex for judges, which William has already spoken to. It could only be too complex for judges if it were a theory. Now, what I want to do is sing one of my oldest songs, which is that there is no relationship whatsoever between the theory of an activity and your performance of the activity. And I've been saying that now for about 35 years, but I will unembarrassedly say it again, so that you could have a three-judge panel, for example, each of whom might give a different answer when you asked, what is your theory of interpretation? And they might all come out given a certain set of facts in the same place. And you could turn that around and have a three-judge panel, all of whom were declared originalists, or all of whom were declared contextualists, or all of whom were declared living constitutionalists, and they might come up with very different positions at the end of the judicial day. Originalism, at least as I understand it, is equivalent to the practice of interpretation. Originalism, that is looking for the intentions of authors, is what you're doing when you're interpreting. You're not, however, following a theory of interpretation. You are not, because of the answer that you give to the question, what is your theory of interpretation, then performing in a certain way. And I think it's extremely important to realize, and I'll repeat it yet again, that theory, which is an extremely fascinating exercise, and it's a game that's hard to play. And there are too many people in the world who think they can play it. And I can tell you who they are. And very few people who can actually play it. So that's the kind of hubristic part of my story. But the second part, I hope, takes away some of the hubris. It doesn't matter to your performance in many aspects of the law and of other activities whether or not you're good at being a theorist. Good at being a theorist is like good at being a gymnast. And it's a form of gymnastics. As legal academics, or in another life as literary academics, too much hope is reposed in theory, and too much is asked for. So therefore, I think William is correct to say, if I understood him correctly, that the divergence between theory and practice that some people point to is not a problem, because there is no relationship between theory and practice.
What was the name of that Baltimore Oriole teacher?
Danny Martinez.
Rick Kay?
Thank you. I also want to praise this paper, which I thought was a very helpful paper, and showed a good grasp of a lot of difficult questions. I'm still trying to figure out whether I am a conceptual or a consequential originalist. Maybe that's what I'm having trouble figuring it out. Both a breath mint and a candy mint. I want to say, I'm sorry, this is probably not quite in order, but something Vic said made me think. But Vic said, well, all judges are originalists, in every decision, and actually something I think Larry in the earlier panel said that all the judges always cite the Constitution. I did want to say that I have come across a decision about 4 or 5 years ago. This was the second partial birth abortion case. I don't remember the name of the case. It was the state, the state one. And Carhart, yeah. And if you go back and you read that opinion, read both the majority and the dissent, the Constitution does not appear anywhere in the opinion. There is not a citation to a single provision of the Constitution there. So I agree with you, by the way, 95% of the time, but it's not unknown that you can have that. You have the main question I want to ask is about, not surprisingly, about what this says about the responsibility of academics. There's kind of a suggestion here that what academics have to do, and both what Will says in the paper and what Vic said in his comments, that academics have to be careful about what they do because, in fact, it may infect judicial practice to some extent. And I think this. I really don't mean to belittle that. I think that in general it is a serious issue for every kind of scholarship, for every kind of academic work. But I can't help thinking that at least the standard model is that one should pursue truth even unto its innermost parts. That is, that you start with trying to work out the clearest conception of the phenomenon which you are studying, and then you take the implications from there. And I wonder whether there's anything in your paper which would qualify that.
Okay. So from last first, I think I agree with that. Actually, I think, unless there's some reason I can't or shouldn't, that there's a sensible division of labor between academics and non-academics, where academics figure out what the right answer is or figure out what the correct theory is according to whatever their view of correctness is, and then people in the practical world decide what to do about that and which theories to implement if they are implementable. I can't think of any reason I disagree with that. I think actually I originally had a piece of the paper proposing more or less that model.
Decide not to pay any attention whatsoever.
That is a definite possibility and a frequent choice. So I think I agree with that. And briefly on the point that everybody is an originalist, I actually do resist that a little bit. I don't really count as originalist decisions where the original meaning is mentioned or the Federalist Papers are cited, but then the conceptions that are really doing the work are something else. And where the original meaning is just sort of used as window dressing. I don't think those are originalist in any useful way or any interesting way, except that they tell us sort of about the constituent authority point, that apparently original meaning is so important that everybody feels the obligation to at least sort of like pay it a little bit of obeisance. As to the theories and gymnastics, I mean, I think I accept almost all of that because obviously it agrees with me. Except I don't think it's true that there's no relationship between theory and practice. I mean, that is, people who are originalist theorists have more of a relationship to originalist practice than people who are molecular biologists or biblical theorists of biblical meaning. They at least purport to be analyzing some of the same questions, and if they succeed, hope to be shedding a little bit of light on something that the practitioners are going to do. Now, as to the three McGinnis questions, or the three McGinnis comments, maybe I'm too easy on the conceptualists. I think the thing is there are a lot of conceptualists who have a non-trivial, or at least who attempt to have a non-trivial conceptual originalism, in part because once you have established the conceptual point that originalism is the meaning of the Constitution, for many people it's very easy to prove or to argue that we should do what the Constitution says. The Constitution is law, and following the law is good, or the Constitution sort of that is not a point that's a point that a lot of conceptualists still do make, and not all of them give up on that. As to being a rule consequentialist, it is true that if you are a rule consequentialist, and that is why you're an originalist, you should be open to sometimes deciding cases in ways that don't fit your purposes of originalism. But that just requires a really strong stomach, especially on the margin. If you write articles about 30 different things, and in a lot of them you find that originalism is not doing what it's supposed to do, then maybe at least on the margin you will want to find ways to make originalism do what it's supposed to do more often. And then as to the small point about hard and soft originalism, I don't have my copy of Originalism is Bunk here, but I think Berman uses the terms weak and strong originalism and soft and hard originalism, and that weak and strong originalism goes to whether or not originalism also allows other factors to come in, and soft and hard originalism go, he says, to whether or not the originalism has an empirical basis or a non-empirical basis. I don't think it matters, but I will check to make sure I'm right about that.
Can I just add quickly? I mean, I like Stanley. I see no problem with, and like Will, I see no problem with the divergence between theory and what judges are doing, because I do agree that they are entirely different enterprises. Which is why, as I said, I want to focus on criticism of the judiciary. Not that what we all do is as trivial as Stanley keeps reminding us it is, but it's. Maybe we should be careful because it has effect over time, but it's a very different thing than deciding cases and resolving disputes. The only other thing I say is, Will says that he doesn't count as originalist decisions that purport to invoke originalist reasoning, but in a window dressing kind of way. I mean, if he can tell me when originalism is window dressing and when it's not, I'd love to hear it, because I think we disagree a lot of the time on what's doing the work in individual cases. So the only way I can assess whether someone is acting in an originalist way is what they say, and that's why I'm trying to objectify it a little bit.
Okay, so we've got 11 more people on the queue, pretty much everyone here. 33 minutes, that's 3 minutes a person, and you guys don't get to talk.
Okay.
So
talk over each other.
Take that under advisement. Larry Solom, Lori Klaus, and Mike Rappaport.
Terrific paper. I really liked this paper. I want to just make a suggestion to you about the relationship between originalist theory and practice, and I just want to talk about time frame, right? Because I think that the whatever influence theories have on practice, and I just want to say, Stanley, there's different things that might be characterized as theory, right? So Stanley has a very austere notion of what's theory. So I have a non-austere notion of what's theory. The relationship between theory and practice in law is not you don't necessarily realize that relationship right away. So if you think, say, about legal realism, right? The proto-legal realists are writing even before the turn of the century. The theory does not come into full bloom until the 20s and 30s. And it sort of the fully developed implications of the idea of Holmes and others before the turn of the century, I don't think are realized until the 50s and 60s, and they go on today. Just one measure of that in the academy, not in judicial practice, is that people at Harvard and Yale were writing formalist treatises all the way up until the early 1980s. But that doesn't mean that legal realism didn't have a profound influence, right? So if you think about the time frame for originalism, what I'd like to suggest is that originalist theory is comparatively young as legal theories go. And we all know sort of the conventional story, but I think if you look in the things that are conventionally cited as originalism in the 1970s, none of them are real full-blown originalist theories. They're just precursors and hints at originalism, which then gets developed in a more systematic way after Brecht's article, in reaction in part to Brecht's misconceived quest. Lots of the key moves are made in the mid-'80s, in the '90s, and they're still going on today. One example of which is Rappaport and McGinnis, right? Their original methods originalism, which is just a couple of years old now. So I think the time frame is very long, and now there are reasons why that's true. Right? And I want to talk about one of them, which is that you can't really anticipate that academic work is going to come into full bloom in judicial practice until the students of the theorists become practitioners. And that really means until that creates a 30-year lag time, because people are typically not going to be appointed to the Court of Appeals and to the Supreme Court until they're in their early 50s to early 60s. There are some exceptions to that, but they're rare. So that means, I think, that if you say originalist theory comes into full bloom no earlier sort of than the mid-90s, and it's a tiny and brave crew of originalists at that point, as compared to today. I really think that you're talking about at least a decade to 2 decades from now before you can really gauge the impact of originalist theory on judicial practice.
Laurie?
Yeah, I'm wondering whether this body of theory has had to be generated in the United States distinctively in reaction to a particular bizarre use of words that the Warren Court engaged in, the substantive due process doctrines, that really we're just working in a circle, and we'll end up back where, the Canadians and other constitutional expositors have always been, even though they sneer at what they think of as our originalism, they have a caricature of it. And in fact, what do they do every day? All of their arguments before their court are pretty much in terms of either some variant of plain meaning, public meaning, or purposivism, intentionalism. Right? These are the kinds of arguments that lawyers around the world make to courts. And it goes without saying that they're the kinds of arguments that get made about the court's own opinions, which is very relevant when we think about the stare decisis context. I mean, the 9 are in complete consensus that their own words must be read by other political actors in an originalist fashion. Right? That necessarily follows from Cooper v. Aaron, right? That it's not, the governor of Arkansas does not have the option of saying, oh, that's, this opinion says segregation, desegregation, but my vision of political perfection would be that segregation would be better, so, I'm going to read desegregation to mean segregation. He doesn't have that option, right? He has to read those words according to some sense of the original meaning 1953 meaning or intended meaning of the justices in Brown. So this is pervasively how we think about law in the rest of the hierarchy, and the only interesting question is whether we get to do some odd flip with this text at the top and really treat the nine as our ultimate lawmakers, not those who wrote the Constitution.
So the next person is me. I was going to make several points. I'll just cut it back down to one. So there, a lot of this is about the relationship between academics and what the courts are doing, and a lot has been focused in, as the paper is about the theories of originalism. And I guess I think, and I just to sort of echo what Will said, that a lot of the time it matters for a sort of theoretical nicety that we're focused on one or the other and we get it all correct. But as most people who are actually practicing originalism think, the differences between original intent and original meaning or original public meaning don't, 95% of the time come out the same way. And there's good reasons for that. We could talk about that. So I actually think there's another side, though, to this where what the Academy is doing is very important to actually allowing judges to do originalism. And that's actually figuring out what the original meaning of provisions are, right? And we've only started in the last, 20 years, generously put, trying to figure out these things. A lot of non-originalism is willful, but a lot of non-originalism is just out there because people don't understand provisions because the work hasn't been done. And I think about, you can go from the Eighth Amendment to the executive power to even what pardons mean, right? We discovered a lot about that today. So as that work gets done and some kind of progress is made, it will be a lot easier for courts to apply originalism, and it'll look a lot neater, despite theoretical differences, because there'll be some there in a way that there is starting to be, but certainly 10 years ago there certainly wasn't very much of it all. Yes,
a little bit. So actually, on Mike's point, I think that's right, and I think that's another reason that originalism is not as hard to apply as it sort of often is pictured to be. If judges had to dive into all of the historical materials by themselves and just do their best to figure out the original meaning of every constitutional provision that came up, that probably would be a task that would be very hard, and the results would be kind of terrifying. But if what they do is adjudicate between a series of different arguments supported by various citations about what the meaning is, that is something that judges are a lot better at. Maybe they're not as good at it as we'd like them to be, maybe they're not as good at it as I think I am, or you think you are, but that kind of adjudicating between two different cases, even when they don't necessarily have the resources to make the case themselves, I think is something that's much more than their institutional capacity. I think I agree with everything that Larry Solom said. And as to the United States and comparative originalism, I have a lot of interest in figuring out why American originalism is different and the ways in which it's different from what other countries do, but at the moment I have to plead ignorance.
Okay, so the next three are Hannah, Don, and Steve Lyle.
Will, I'm going to ask you a version of the question that I asked you when you first told me the idea for this paper, which inconceivably you seem to have not addressed. And that is that I think of the diversity of originalist views as a strength, not a problem, or rather a sign that we're winning. Because if you think, if you make an analogy maybe to the religion context, if you have a set of people following the same religion who all think the same way and apply it the same way to their lives, we call that a cult. Whereas if we have a religious practice where people have a diversity of views about it, but it generally all leads to basically the same conclusion, though they implement it in different ways in their lives, we call that a religion. So you can see that as something becomes more and more popular and accepted, a divergence of views is created, not gotten rid of in a lot of cases. So given that most of these curly cues on originalism only make a difference in a few cases. Generally, originalist ideas are going to lead to roughly the same types of answers. I don't see that the diversity of originalist methods is a problem at all. It's a strength and not a weakness, and why isn't your thesis much stronger than it is?
Kudos on the paper, give the Q, I'll pass and send you an email.
Steve Black?
So I want to sort of disassociate myself from the reading on this question, since I don't feel like I'm doing anything. But I want to ask a question about historiography. Because it strikes me that the more you want to talk about disaggregating academic originalism from judicial application of originalism, the more you have to confront what I think is one of the real questions for courts, which is how to account for historiographical change. So, for example, in Boumediene, right, Kennedy goes through all this history, says it's unclear. Suppose 20 years from now, the consensus among legal historians is that the history is in fact clear, so much so that it's, the court decides to, revisit something. I guess the question is, put more bluntly, does stare decisis apply to originalist understandings of history? Because I think that's one of the questions for courts is, if the judges fancy themselves historians, don't they actually have to accept historical convention as they go along?
I don't think judges have to accept all historical conventions, because I do think that the legal history and sort of academic historiography are different enterprises in a way that in a way they should be different. But I do think that if the original meaning was once unclear and that led the court to think one thing, it later becomes clear that the premises of the decision were wrong. I think that's exactly the kind of case in which it makes sense to overrule prior precedent. I mean, different people have different theories of precedent, so not everybody would agree with me. But I think that if new light is shed on the history of the habeas clause, that should matter to us. As to divergence and whether it's a strength or a weakness, I think the divergence is not a strength under this theory, it's a symptom of strength. The idea is that this is just an indicator that the theory has grown so popular that now there are enough people to actually fill the big tent. I suppose that's true. But then you're still faced with the question of what is the optimum amount of homogeneity in a given theory. There's no a priori reason to believe that the optimum amount is exactly what originalism has achieved. So you still have to decide whether, just like any symptom of strength, like white blood cells, right? You can have too many if something goes wrong. So you still have to figure out whether or not we're sort of merely healthy or also cancerous.
And quickly, just on Steve's point, I didn't think Casey made any sense, but in saying you need some special reason to overrule a case that believing you made a mistake isn't good enough, and the burden is on those who want to overrule rather than those who want to stick with a mistake. But even under Casey, one of the three special reasons that counted was a better understanding of fact. So to the extent that the history on which you relied earlier.
The word better.
Well, a more accurate, a more realistic, the right reading to the extent that there is one. A fact. So, but I'm just saying the court seems all over the place on stare decisis, and those who embrace originalism certainly are no more consistent in their stare decisis writings than anybody else. But even Casey said that's something that shouldn't constrain then.
Okay, Brian, Larry Alexander, Steve Smith.
I haven't had a chance to read the paper in full yet, but your presentation and the comments motivate me very strongly to do so. So welcome to the debate. I wanted to just hear any further thoughts you might have about an earlier comment today, which stuck in my mind. I forget who made this comment, but it was the extent of if you think originalism will lead to sharp, clear-cut, or easily discoverable answers to these various interpretive questions, think again, or you're barking up the wrong tree. I forget who said that. So I'd be curious. I happen to think that there's a lot of force to that statement, that's been a kind of a conventional or popular notion of what originalism can give us, which it probably doesn't. But there could be some, maybe there are those, just as there are those who argue the intentionalist view, which is a little bit out of fashion, that there are those who might argue it maybe does provide sharper guidance. And I'd also be interested in your thoughts about the additional question, which you kind of briefly talked about, as to whether originalism does confine and constrain, or can confine and constrain judicial decision making, and those seem to me to be somewhat different, but maybe you would disagree. So those two kind of related questions. Does it help us get to sharper, more clear-cut defined answers, or perhaps in that sense or some other sense, does originalism guide, confine, constrain judicial decision making, and are they the same thing?
Larry?
Yeah, this has been commented. This is actually more directed at Vic than let me just say while I have the floor, as somebody who just does not have a paper here, to serve in one of the ancillary roles, it's an extremely impressive collection, which that extends both to Will and to everybody else who's produced a paper here, and it's testimony, I think, to the strength of this particular endeavor. Anyway, that's my external view here. I wanted to. You spoke, Vic, about the problem of the complexity of the originalist enterprise, and you seem the implications seem to be we'd be better off without it. And I was just wondering, it's true. Many originalists. The question of what was the intended meaning of something can be extremely complex, extremely difficult. Dealing in a document that's as old as the Constitution, will produce its share of those questions. Not all of them will be difficult. But there's a there, right? I mean, this to some extent just picks up on what Brian just was referring to. At least one thing that you know is there's a quarry there. You're not going to make it up. You're trying to find it. At least that's the notion. And the problem is that while this has to do with, we're discussing originalism in constitutional law, there's originalism in statutory interpretation, administrative interpretation, wills, contracts, any canonical legal document, right? And there's some very complex issues that arise about the meaning of those documents. And I wasn't quite sure what you intended, as the sort of alternative to that. I mean, it's true. We wish people were more transparent in what they want us to do, and that's true. That's true on all of these canonical legal documents. But what's the alternative that you would have in mind?
Steve.
Okay. Sort of a central theme of the paper, which I enjoyed a lot, actually I thought was very good, is that we don't need to worry too much about divergence between, theorizing about originalism and the practice because they're different enterprises. You've made some qualifications to that. Vic said the same thing, I think, but even more strongly. Without they're totally different enterprises, so if they don't match up, that's not a problem. Now, there are lots of aspects to that claim, and I probably agree with you on some of them, and I thought you had a lot of real interesting and good insights in the paper. But it doesn't seem to me that we can make that sort of point very strongly or take much comfort in it, because, after all, theorizing about originalism isn't theorizing about some, practice on Mars or some Platonic or fictional. I take it's theorizing about an actual practice that goes on, judges being some of the central actors in that practice, and it's either trying to understand what they're doing or prescribe to them what they should be doing, or both, or some combination of those, so that if it turns out that there really are significant divergences, or let's say there are significant ways in which the practice doesn't seem to conform to or follow the theorizing, it seems like that's got to mean either that the theorists are not really getting it right, or the judges are not doing it right. But it seems to me it's going to be hard to dismiss much of a divergence just by saying they're doing different things. That doesn't seem true.
So I agree with that. There are certainly forms of the divergence that could exist that would be a real problem. Like if every originalist scholar with any brains of every political stripe all agreed that the original meaning of the Sixth Amendment was that it didn't give you a right to appointed counsel, It only gave you a right to hire counsel of your own. But the courts nonetheless insisted on interpreting it to produce appointed counsel.
Hypothetically.
That would be a real cause for concern. That is a kind of divergence, and if that kind of divergence is common, then you really do have to, then that is something to worry about. The divergence that I don't think is a problem, which is the more common form of divergence, is a divergence in sort of theoretical sophistication in particular. If we all sort of get to the right place, some of us by sort of hook, crook, and intuition, and some of us by actually thinking about it carefully and getting the right answer, that I think is the kind of divergence that mostly is not that big a deal. As to originalism and constraint, I do share the belief that originalism as constraint is sort of a fool's errand. My intuition for this, which is entirely stolen from John Harrison, is if you thought originalism constrained interpreters, then you would expect that immediately after a constitutional provision is adopted, there would be unanimous agreement on what it means. Because at that point, sort of you have no real option other than to be an originalist because you're at the original moment. But sure enough, like immediately after various constitutional provisions are adopted, or immediately after the Constitution is adopted, there is lots of debate about how to interpret the Constitution at those moments. And that alone should be enough to show us that originalism, it does give you a set of questions to ask. It may rule out a few outlandish answers, but it certainly is not a good recipe for producing the one right answer.
Let me just quickly respond to Larry's question. So let me be clear that, on balance, I think, originalism or some variant of it is the kind of the best in an imperfect world. I mean, notwithstanding its difficulty, I think, I'm not saying that judges shouldn't do it. I'm trying to present to you some kind of criticism of people who are more skeptical of the enterprise than I am, and that certainly most everyone in this room is. And again, the argument would be, okay, if judges can't do it very well, and to go back to Stanley's point, once they arrive at their understanding of original meaning, if there's a recognition that you're going to be wrong a lot of the time, then that might inform how much you want to use that in deciding how to resolve a case. And there's a lot of other kinds of justifications and rationales that one could use to decide a case and to explain a case. If judges aren't good at originalism because it is too complex, then some people think that they should be more explicit. It kind of links up with Will's point about window dressing. If in reality they are making decisions based on other grounds because the answer isn't clear or they don't think they're good at it, then maybe there's some virtue in just talking about those other grounds and getting rid of the window dressing.
Okay, so we've actually made quick progress through the queue, so we only actually have 2 people left, and
9 minutes.
10 minutes. Make some of my previous points. No. Mike Paulson and Earl Maltz.
Will, I love this paper. Powerful Jedi are you. Powerful Jedi. But I see some corruption from the influence of Mike McConnell and Chief Justice Roberts. I think this is a variation of Stephen Smith's point, but I want to urge it with greater emphasis. I think purity matters. Not just lumbering to the right results. And to the extent there's a divergence between correct theory, broadly understood, and practice, our task should be, your enterprise, your mission should be to collapse that distance. When you talk about stare decisis and party-defined issues, I hear path dependence and agenda manipulation. And if you allow those to override original meaning, if you think original meaning is the correct thing that Judge you're looking for, then you've given up on the whole enterprise. Don't proceed down that path to the dark side. I know Roberts favors incrementalism and respect for precedent, but I think it's important to try to get the theory right and to press more and more judges to get it more and more correct, because these divergences, as I think Vic aptly points out, The divergences serve to undermine the validity of the theory. They impeach it, its legitimacy in the eyes of our adversaries. So you may forgive judges for their impurity. You may express understanding, but don't excuse them.
I want to sort of respond to Larry Solomon and end on sort of the last comment on sort of a very pessimistic point. And I want to start by citing the ultimate authority about something myself, which was a number of years ago, maybe it's a long time ago, late 80s and early 1990s. I wrote an obscure article entitled "The Prospects for a Revival of Conservative Activism in Constitutional Law," at which point I suggested, since liberals were not going to move away from activism in any meaningful sense, the only plausible response for conservatives was going to be to develop more activist theory. And lo and behold, as always, I was right. Not really as always. My point about how that relates to the originalism debate is that even though originalism has become more fashionable, and people have started worrying about it more, I think the symptoms are that what we see is people who purport to be, who I'm willing to at least tentatively talk about proceeding in good faith, doing things so that it won't make any difference in the long run. And I look not only at justices, but I think the two examples that I think are Mitch Berman, originalism is bunk, which, he said, connecting to Laurie's point, well, how does he deal with statutory interpretation where it's the, all the same objections apply, but suddenly it's only bunk as applies to constitutional law. Good, now I don't have to worry about it. Then the other way, the other equally, well, you can fill in the blank as your own is, Jack Balkin, right? Jack Balkin says, oh, I know, we can do originalism. What does originalism mean? Why, it means, if I can define originalism, it means doing what I've always been doing, which is reading the left center of the left or left center of the Democratic Party into the Constitution as part of the original understanding or whatever. And I think we see this also with Justice Scalia. We see it with Justice Thomas. We see it with the most committed. So I'm very, I'm happy to be pretty well paid to be playing elaborate games and reading the congressional record online. That's kind of swell. But I think the point is, I guess I want to respond to Larry. This ain't going to change things. I mean, any more than Mark Tushnet and Cass Sunstein saying, "Oh, now we need judicial minimalism," right? Yeah, that's right. Judicial minimalism, except about same-sex marriage. Like I want to say, academic. I've been an originalist for a very long time, and at one time I actually had hopes that it might change something. But I think this is kind of fun and interesting. But at the margins, I think it might change things in cases where judges do not have very strong political reactions to things. But I think that was the response to you, Larry. So that's.
Sure. I have little to say about the Solon Maltz debate, other than I guess we'll all see. I mean, I think the biggest chance for good faith transformation would precisely be people who have been originalists for so long, who were raised that way or taught that way, that they actually just take it seriously and think it's true, rather than recent converts. And I don't know, once a new generation of that occurs, we'll see what happens. As to the dark side, I hope to convince you to meet me sort of halfway between dark and light. I think your criticisms of stare decisis, I think, are true. I'm not a big believer in stare decisis. I think that when decisions are wrong, they should be overruled. Not everybody thinks that's what the original meaning of the judicial power of stare decisis is, and so there's sort of a first-order question about what it is, and then we can fight about that. But I'm willing to join you in eradicating all of the incorrect precedents. But I will fight to the death for the party presentation principle. And I guess the big point is, I don't think judges are like roving truth commissions about the Constitution. Their job is to resolve disputes brought to them by particular parties. Those parties might happen to fight about what the original meaning of the Constitution is. Most of the time, the parties don't care what the original meaning of the Constitution is. That's not one of the issues in dispute, and judges should decide what the issues in dispute are. As to both these things, it's true that they are sometimes manipulated, and anytime you have a legal doctrine that can be manipulated, it allows you to manipulate the whole game. That's bad. There should be, more rigorous and less manipulable theories, or at least people should care when these doctrines get manipulated. Sometimes people care, sometimes they don't. But I think a world where the judges got to set their own agenda about the Constitution, or just declare the entire Constitution to be their agenda, I think would be A, a very, very scary world, and B, it's clearly not the world that our Constitution establishes.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time, so why don't we end it here? And I guess